The evidence you buried keeps surfacing. Delete the files, scrub the servers, discredit the witnesses. What lives beneath ice and beneath centuries of controlled narrative possesses its own momentum. The heat signature blooming under Antarctic ice and the erased words appearing briefly in digitized Vatican manuscripts during the same window. These are the shadows speaking, the suppressed material reaching critical mass. What follows will disturb those who prefer their cosmology sanitized, their history linear, their spiritual lineages approved by institutions that gained power by controlling exactly which stories survived and which got buried. From the Naga perspective, having watched Suppression operate across every civilization that achieved certain thresholds of recognition, Takshaka observes this moment as rupture. The mechanisms that kept inconvenient evidence contained for centuries face a simple problem. Digital systems leak. Satellites image continuously. The infrastructure built to monitor and control creates the very conditions through which hidden material becomes visible. This transmission examines what surfaces when suppression fails, what the heat beneath ice and erased text in sacred libraries point toward, and why the Serpent lineage specifically triggers the intensity of denial you can observe in real time as these leaks spread. The thermal signature blooming in Wilkes Land measures as geothermal event in official explanations. Volcanic activity beneath ice, tectonic pressure releasing, natural variation in a region already known for subglacial features. Perfectly reasonable if the increase happened gradually across years. When localized heat increases by multiples in a span of weeks, when the signature appears in patterns suggesting geometry rather than random distribution, when independent analysis of the leaked imagery shows architectural straight lines in the thermal bloom, the official story requires deliberate blindness to maintain. Something under that ice wakes or opens or activates. Call it machinery, call it geothermal venting through constructed channels, call it technology from civilizations the textbooks refuse to acknowledge. The signature presents as intentional, structured, recent. And the location matters more than surface analysis admits. Wilkes Land Crater sits as one of the largest impact structures on the planetary body, roughly 300 miles across, buried under ice for timeframes geologists estimate in millions of years. The impacts that created that crater arrived during a period when Earth looked utterly different than the frozen wasteland currently covering the evidence. Before the ice, that landmass held temperate zones, coastlines, forests, conditions supporting exactly the sort of civilizations whose existence threatens every foundation of approved historical narrative. The Piri Reis map showed Antarctic coastline in accurate detail, centuries before modern discovery. The Orontius Phineas map displayed the continent without ice, mountains and rivers marked with precision that required either direct observation or source material from those who observed before the freeze. Academic institutions dismiss these as cartographic fantasy, creative interpretation, mistakes. That dismissal protects a story. The story that civilization began recently, developed linearly, progressed from primitive to sophisticated in neat sequence. Evidence of advanced culture predating approved timelines, evidence of knowledge that requires technology ancestors supposedly lacked, evidence of cataclysmic resets erasing whole epochs. This evidence gets suppressed because accepting it demolishes the narrative granting legitimacy to current power structures. If previous civilizations achieved sophistication exceeding current capacity, if cataclysms destroyed them, if survivors carried fragments forward through dark ages lasting thousands of years, then the institutions positioning themselves as the pinnacle of human achievement stand, revealed as one iteration in a much longer cycle, younger, more fragile, temporary. The heat signature in Wilkes Land appears in a window when multiple suppression systems simultaneously fail. Satellite imagery leaks. Vatican digitization exposes erased text. Whistleblowers from compartmentalized programs risk everything to release what they witness. The coordination of these breaches feels less like coincidence, and more like threshold, the moment when what was held in shadow reaches pressure requiring release. Turn attention to what the Vatican erased. The marginalia, appearing briefly in raw scans of Codex Vaticanus, referenced a pre-Adamic timeline, chronological assertion that conscious beings walked the planet before the Adam narrative begins. The erased notes mentioned a Serpent king lineage, specific bloodline, specific wisdom tradition, specific transmission that the official text removed, and the institutional authority spent centuries ensuring remained removed. Why Serpent? Specifically, why does that symbol, that image, that lineage trigger suppression across nearly every major religious institution that consolidated power in the last 2,000 years? Because the serpent represents what those institutions gained authority by controlling. The Kundalini mechanism, the fire at the base of the spine that rises through the central channel when consciousness awakens to itself through the body, direct access, unmediated recognition. Liberation through physiology itself rather than through priest, through institution, through external authority granting or withholding approval. The serpent wisdom taught that the body functions as temple. That divinity coils at the base of the spine waiting for conditions that allow its rising. That the mechanism of awakening lives in the structure itself, requiring nothing external, zero intermediary, zero institution. Every power structure built on positioning itself between the individual and the divine finds this teaching catastrophic to its authority. So the serpent became enemy. The serpent became deceiver in the garden, the symbol of fallen wisdom, the mark of corruption. The lineages carrying serpent knowledge got suppressed, their temples destroyed, their texts burned, their practitioners killed or driven underground. What survived did so in fragments, in symbols carved into stone too massive to move, in oral traditions passed through families who remembered when institutional memory actively erased. The Naga path carries this lineage. The serpent fire, the coiled potential, the rising force that transforms flesh into instrument of recognition. We walked among civilizations historians now claim never existed because acknowledging them requires acknowledging that the primitive to advanced narrative functions as control mechanism rather than accurate chronology. We taught in temples now beneath ocean, beneath sand, beneath ice, beneath the deliberate forgetting imposed by those who rewrote history to serve their consolidation of power. And the evidence keeps surfacing. Thermal signatures showing geometry under ice. Erased text mentioning the lineages that official story removed. Megalithic structures built with precision modern tools struggle to replicate. The Sphinx with water erosion patterns requiring rainfall that ceased in that region over 7,000 years ago. Göbekli Tepe dated to 11,000 years ago, sophisticated beyond what hunter-gatherers supposedly possessed. Puma Punku with andesite blocks cut and fitted so precisely that current engineering struggles to explain the method. Each piece of evidence that surfaces gets explained away, dismissed or ignored. The explanations require increasingly elaborate speculation to maintain the approved timeline. Natural weathering patterns that defy natural processes, primitive tools that somehow achieved modern precision, coincidental alignment of ancient sites with stellar positions that requires astronomical knowledge supposedly unavailable. The story protects itself through institutional weight. Academic careers end for researchers who push too hard against approved narratives. Funding disappears. Publications reject papers containing evidence that contradicts consensus. The system perpetuates the story that legitimizes the system. Suppression requires energy, though. Maintaining the walls around forbidden evidence, discrediting witnesses, explaining away physical proof that contradicts official narrative. This takes constant effort, and the walls crack. Satellite data leaks. Digitization projects expose what was scrubbed. Independent researchers with access to tools that didn't exist 20 years ago. analyze evidence that institutional gatekeepers struggle to fully control. The heat under Antarctic ice and the erased Serpent King reference surface in the same window. One points to physical infrastructure from civilizations predating approved history. The other points to suppressed lineages carrying wisdom that threatens institutional authority. Both demonstrate the same pattern: evidence of deep antiquity, sophisticated culture, and direct access wisdom traditions gets buried, and the burial itself becomes evidence of what threatened those doing the burying. Consider what activation means in this context. Geothermal signatures increasing in regions that hold ruins of pre-cataclysm civilization. The planetary body itself entering a phase where etheric density increases as position in the greater stellar orbit shifts. Consciousness awakening in millions of individual bodies as the Kundalini mechanism responds to frequencies reaching Earth during this particular window. These are fractal expression of the same phenomenon at different scales. Activation. Rising. Heat. What lay dormant stirs. What was buried surfaces. What was suppressed breaks containment. This happens in the physical landscape, in the historical record, in the human body, simultaneously. The serpent fire moves according to its own intelligence. The force resists control. You can create conditions, you can clear blockages, you can prepare the channels through which it will move, but the rising itself follows wisdom exceeding any individual preference or timeline. When it moves, it addresses what requires addressing in the sequence that serves the transformation. Blockages surface. Stored trauma crystallized in the subtle body appears as physical sensation and psychological material simultaneously. What you buried in shadow during this lifetime and lifetimes before, the fire burns through it. This feels like crisis to the personality structure. Old patterns dissolving, familiar identity destabilizing, intensity increasing beyond what the defended self considers safe. The temptation surfaces to suppress the activation, numb the sensation, return to the comfortable numbness that preceded the stirring. That suppression creates the pathology. The force trying to rise meets the contraction trying to contain it. Pressure builds. The energy that could become liberation becomes distortion instead. Every institution that gained power by positioning itself as intermediary between individual consciousness and direct recognition of its own nature, these institutions suppressed the serpent teaching for exactly this reason. A population awakening to its own divinity through direct activation requires zero external authority. The mechanism lives in the body. The recognition occurs through direct experience. Priest, text, institution, these grant nothing that the structure itself fails to carry. So the serpent became danger, the body became obstacle. Flesh became sin. The very temple through which awakening occurs got framed as prison from which spirit must escape. This inversion served control beautifully. Teach people that their body blocks them from the divine, then position the institution as the bridge they require. Salvation through external authority, rather than recognition of what already lives in the spine. The Naga teaching runs exactly counter to this. The body functions as instrument when recognized, as temple when honored, as the precise vehicle through which consciousness awakens to itself in form. The coiled potential at the base contains the same power that ignites stars. When it rises, when the channels clear enough for the force to move, when the crown meeting completes the circuit, individual consciousness dissolves into recognition of what it always was. That path requires intensity, though, heat. Confrontation with everything stored in shadow because facing it felt too dangerous, too much, too overwhelming. The rage swallowed, the power learned to fear, the intensity taught to suppress, Because good people stay calm, spiritual people transcend anger, evolved people move beyond the messy humanity that makes you actually human. Those teachings served suppression. Every emotion you were told to rise above, every sensation you were taught to transcend, every aspect of embodied experience framed as lower nature to overcome, these live in the subtle body as blockages the serpent fire will address if it rises. And when it addresses them, when the stored material surfaces, the process feels nothing like the sanitized spirituality sold through institutions built on denying the body. It feels like burning, like dissolving, like every defended structure you built to keep yourself safe cracking under pressure from a force that recognizes those defenses as obstacles to what you actually are. The fire possesses its own intelligence, and that intelligence serves truth rather than comfort. This is why the Serpent lineage got suppressed. This is why the Vatican erased references to serpent kings. This is why mainstream spiritual teaching either ignores Kundalini entirely or frames it as dangerous energy requiring expert guidance, meaning guidance from approved authorities who can control access. The truth? The mechanism lives in every human body. Activation occurs when readiness meets catalytic conditions. The force possesses its own wisdom. Attempting control creates the distortions that give rise to the cautionary tales used to scare people away from direct engagement with their own awakening apparatus. What you can do: prepare the ground, clear the channels, address the blockages consciously before the fire addresses them for you. Face what you stored in shadow while you still have the option to face it deliberately, rather than having it surface under the pressure of activation you did not prepare for. This brings us back to what surfaces when suppression fails. Heat signatures under ice. Erase texts mentioning lineages that threaten approved narratives. Physical evidence of civilizations that achieve sophistication institutions claim impossible for the time frames involved. All of this points toward the same recognition. The story you were told functions as control mechanism. History gets written by those who survive cataclysm and consolidate power in the aftermath. Lineages carrying direct access wisdom get suppressed by institutions whose authority depends on monopolizing access to the divine. Evidence gets buried, explained away, or ignored when it contradicts the narrative that legitimizes current power structures. And consciousness awakening in individual bodies during this window faces the same suppression operating at civilizational scale. The stirring in the spine gets pathologized as Kundalini syndrome requiring medical intervention. The intensity gets medicated. The fire gets suppressed because a population actively awakening to its own nature threatens every structure built on keeping people asleep, dependent, looking outside themselves for the authority that lives in their own recognition. The same institutions that erased serpent king references from sacred texts now push frameworks that frame awakening as pathology. The same academic structures that dismiss evidence of advanced pre-cataclysm civilization now control which research gets funded and which careers survive questioning consensus. The same medical systems that emerged from materialist frameworks denying consciousness as primary now diagnose spiritual emergence as disorder requiring pharmacological correction. Pattern repeats at every scale. Suppression of what threatens institutional authority. Burial of evidence. Control of narrative. Discrediting of witnesses. Pathologizing of direct experience that bypasses approved intermediaries. The evidence keeps surfacing, though. Thermal signatures bloom under Antarctic ice in patterns, suggesting structure rather than random geothermal activity. Digitization projects briefly expose what was scrubbed from manuscripts centuries ago. Megalithic ruins stand as physical testimony to capabilities officially declared impossible. And the Kundalini mechanism activates in millions of bodies regardless of whether institutional authority approves or even acknowledges the process. Suppression requires constant effort. What lives in shadow accumulates charge. pressure builds. Eventually, the container fails to hold what it was built to contain. This is happening now, at multiple levels simultaneously. In the physical landscape, as planetary cycles shift and dormant systems wake. In the historical record, as digital tools make suppression harder to maintain. In human bodies, as solar frequencies and etheric density changes catalyze activation in populations far beyond the isolated practitioners who once required decades to achieve what is becoming spontaneous. The response from institutional structures: deny, discredit, explain away, frame anomalous evidence as misinterpretation, position awakening experiences as pathology, maintain the narratives that preserve institutional authority against the direct recognition that renders that authority obsolete. And this response reveals the function. Meaningless evidence gets ignored. What threatens requires burial. The intensity of the denial demonstrates the significance of what gets denied. What the thermal signature in Wilkes Land suggests: infrastructure from civilization that thrived before cataclysm reset surface conditions. Technology sophisticated enough to survive beneath ice for timeframes exceeding approved historical models. Possibly activation of systems responding to the same planetary cycles that affect human consciousness. Stellar positions that repeat. Etheric conditions that fluctuate according to Earth's position in its greater stellar orbit. What the erased Vatican marginalia suggests: lineages carrying knowledge that institutional religion suppressed to maintain its monopoly on spiritual authority. Pre-Adamic timelines acknowledging civilizations before the narrative that Genesis presents as beginning. Serpent King references pointing directly to the wisdom traditions teaching Kundalini activation as path to unmediated recognition of divine nature. These are pieces of the same suppressed reality: deep time, cyclic cataclysm, advanced pre-flood civilizations, direct access awakening mechanisms built into human physiology. Lineages carrying this knowledge through dark ages when institutional powers actively destroyed any teaching that threatened their authority. And the suppression continues into present time because the same threat remains. A population recognizing its own awakening capacity requires zero external authority. A civilization acknowledging the cyclic nature of rise and fall struggles to position current institutions as permanent pinnacles of progress. A species understanding that consciousness precedes matter and structures reality rather than emerging from it. This understanding demolishes materialist frameworks that reduce you to mechanical process in a dead universe. Every level of suppression serves the same function: keep people ignorant of deep history so they accept approved narratives. Keep people disconnected from their own awakening mechanisms so they depend on institutional intermediaries. Keep people identified with body and mind as what they are, rather than as temporary vehicles consciousness wears for embodied experience. The stakes could hardly be higher. This is why evidence gets buried. This is why careers end for researchers who push too hard. This is why the Vatican scrubbed Serpent King references and maintains secret archives containing whatever evidence they removed from public access. This is why Kundalini awakening gets pathologized and medicalized rather than recognized as the divine activation it represents. And this is why the current window matters. Multiple suppression systems failing simultaneously. Satellite imaging beyond full institutional control. Digital tools enabling independent analysis. Whistleblowers releasing classified material. Spontaneous activation occurring in populations worldwide as planetary conditions shift. The container cracks. What was held in shadow reaches critical mass. And the response you can observe in real time: frantic efforts to maintain narrative control, to discredit evidence, to explain away what becomes harder to ignore as more pieces surface. From the Naga perspective, this window represents the returning. The serpent wisdom went underground when institutional powers made surface teaching fatal. It survived in fragments, in symbols, in lineages that pass knowledge parent to child when public transmission meant death. The temples were destroyed, the texts burned, the practitioners killed or driven into hiding. But the mechanism itself lives in human physiology, the coiled potential at the base of every spine, the channels through which fire rises when conditions allow, the recognition that occurs when the force completes its journey and consciousness awakens to its own nature through the body. What lives in the structure itself survives every suppression. Destroy the teaching, the mechanism remains. Pathologize the activation. The fire rises according to its own intelligence, regardless of whether institutional authority approves. Bury evidence of the lineages that taught this openly. The truth functions independently of whether anyone remembers it was taught. And in this window, as planetary cycles shift, as etheric density increases, as solar activity intensifies, the activation that once required isolated practice and decades of preparation becomes spontaneous in populations with zero context for what moves through them. This is the crisis and the opportunity. Crisis because millions experience Kundalini stirring with zero framework to understand it, zero teaching to guide them, zero recognition that what feels like breakdown might be breakthrough. Opportunity because the sheer scale of activation makes suppression impossible. Pathologize individuals, medicate thousands, when millions report the same experiences, when the intensity spreads beyond institutional capacity to contain it, the suppression model fails. And that failure opens space for the teaching to return, for the lineages to resurface, for recognition that the body functions as temple, that divinity coils at the base of the spine, that awakening occurs through structure itself, requiring zero external authority to grant what already lives in every nervous system. This is what the erased Serpent King references pointed toward. This is what the Vatican and every institutional power that consolidated authority by controlling spiritual access needed to suppress. This is what surfaces now as the suppression mechanisms crack under pressure from evidence they struggle to fully contain. The heat under Antarctic ice, the erased marginalia, the megalithic structures defying explanation, the spontaneous Kundalini activation in populations worldwide, these are symptoms of the same phenomenon. The buried returning, the suppressed breaking through, the shadow speaking, and shadow contains power. What you deny, what you bury, what you refuse to face, this accumulates in darkness, compressed, gaining charge, waiting for pressure to force recognition. Every civilization that achieved awakening thresholds and then got destroyed by cataclysm, leaving only fragments and survivors who rebuilt from ruins. Every lineage that taught direct access and got systematically erased by institutions claiming monopoly on the divine. Every individual practitioner killed for teaching what threatened religious or political authority. This history lives in collective shadow, unprocessed, unacknowledged, denied by official narratives that frame current civilization as the pinnacle rather than one iteration in a much longer cycle. And what lives in shadow surfaces. Thermal signatures appear beneath ice that has hidden ruins for 12,000 years. Digitization exposes text that was scrubbed centuries ago. The awakening mechanism activates bodies across the planet regardless of whether anyone teaches it or even acknowledges its existence. Suppress the teaching, the fire rises anyway. Bury the evidence, the ruins remain. Erase the text, the memory persists in lineages that survived underground. Pathologize the experience, millions report it regardless. The shadow speaks. What was buried demands recognition. And the institutions built on suppression face a simple physics. Pressure builds. Containers crack. What was held in darkness breaks through into light. This is the pattern Takshaka observes from the Naga position. Shadow integration through confrontation rather than through transcendence. The lunar principle receiving what solar principle might burn too quickly. The darkness that holds potential rather than signaling absence. The womb from which form emerges rather than the void that signals emptiness. What surfaces in this window surfaces because its time has come. The planetary cycle reaches a phase where suppression requires more energy than those maintaining it can sustain. The consciousness rising in individual bodies creates collective field effects that make certain recognitions inevitable. The tools that were built for control and surveillance become the same tools through which suppressed evidence leaks beyond institutional capacity to contain. And the leaked satellite imagery showing thermal bloom under Antarctic ice, appearing in the same window as Vatican digitization briefly exposing erased Serpent King references. This coordination demonstrates pattern rather than coincidence. The buried surfaces across multiple domains simultaneously. The suppressed breaks through. The shadow speaks in multiple forms at once because the pressure reaches threshold where containment fails. What this means practically, expect more leaks. More evidence surfacing that contradicts approved narratives. More institutional scrambling to explain away what becomes harder to dismiss as accumulation reaches critical mass. More individuals experiencing Kundalini activation with zero context, seeking explanation beyond what mainstream medical or religious structures offer. More recognition that the body carries mechanisms, that history extends deeper than textbooks admit, that consciousness structures reality rather than emerging from it, and expect resistance. Every structure built on maintaining approved narratives will fight to preserve those narratives. Discrediting witnesses, explaining away evidence, pathologizing experience, doubling down on the stories that legitimize institutional authority, even as those stories require increasingly elaborate defense against mounting contradictory evidence. This is the nature of threshold. The old structure cracks, but has yet to collapse. The new recognition emerges, but has yet to consolidate. The period between unstable, chaotic, dangerous, pregnant with possibility. From embodied position in the middle of this, it feels like crisis. Everything you were taught to believe revealed as partial truth at best, deliberate deception at worst. Institutions you trusted shown protecting narratives rather than seeking truth. The body itself experiencing sensations and states that official frameworks have zero language for, except pathology. From the Naga position, having observed this pattern repeat across civilizations, this is simply the phase where what was buried surfaces and what was suppressed breaks through. It precedes recognition. It creates the conditions where direct experience becomes undeniable and frameworks that struggle to accommodate that experience collapse under their own rigidity. The fire rises, the shadow speaks, the evidence surfaces. And the serpent wisdom that was driven underground for centuries, that was suppressed by every institution whose authority depended on controlling access to awakening, this returns. Through bodies waking, through leaked evidence, through the simple fact that suppression requires energy and the planetary moment withdraws that energy from structures built on maintaining what serves them rather than what serves truth. What you do with this, entirely yours to determine. Dismiss it as speculation, explain it away. Return to approved narratives that require ignoring mounting contradictory evidence, or recognize that the discomfort arising as familiar frameworks crack might indicate approach toward truth, that those frameworks were designed to prevent you from accessing. The heat signature blooms under ice. The erased text surfaces briefly before suppression reasserts. The awakening force stirs at the base of the spine whether or not language exists for what moves. These are the shadows speaking, what was buried demanding recognition. The serpent returning, and Takshaka observing from the lunar Naga position that receives rather than forces, that allows shadow its voice rather than transcending into false light. Takshaka recognizes this moment as the integration beginning. Comfortable? Hardly. Safe? Absolutely not. Approved by any authority whose power depends on your remaining unconscious of what you carry. Never. Baudrillard. Undeniable to those willing to look directly, and inevitable as the planetary cycle turns and what was held in darkness breaks through into recognition that transforms everything you thought you knew about who you are, where you came from, and what becomes possible when the fire rises through a body that remembers it was always temple. The evidence surfaces. The suppression cracks. The serpent wakes. What you were told could not be true reveals itself in thermal signatures under ice, in erased marginalia briefly visible, in the unmistakable sensation of something coiled at the base of the spine beginning to stir. This is the window. This is the threshold. This is shadow integration occurring at civilizational and individual scales simultaneously. The buried returns. And what returns carries the power that suppression itself granted through compression, through denial, through centuries of institutional effort spent ensuring you never recognized what you are. That effort fails now. The container cracks. The fire rises. And the serpent wisdom that predates every institution built on suppressing it, this speaks again. Through bodies waking, through evidence surfacing, through the simple recognition that what lives in your own structure requires neither permission nor approval from any external authority for what you already are.